We are here on the Lasting Love Connection podcast with Dr. Elaine Aron. She's a clinical research psychologist. She's the author of 5 books on high sensitivity. We're so thrilled to have you on the Lasting Love Connection podcast, Dr. Aron.
I'm delighted to be with you.
Now, one of the things that really excites me about getting you on the show is your research and work around people, individuals, and relationships around the topic of being highly sensitive people, the acronym HSP. I found your work to be really interesting because, as someone who comes from a strong spirituality background, I hear that term being thrown around very loosely without a whole lot of kind of bona fide evidence or research or something to really ground it so we can say, hey, here is what HSP is, here's what it means, here are some of the identifiers. I would love to start by having you talk a little bit about your research and then telling us a little bit about, how do we know if we are highly sensitive? But first, let's definitely start with some of your research.
Fine. Yes, it's interesting that I was doing research with my husband on love and close relationships, and he and I are both very kind of experimentally rigorous. So then someone made this comment to me that I was highly sensitive, and I didn't know what that meant. So the first thing I did was I did 40 interviews with people who said that they thought they were highly sensitive. And then from that, I came up with about 65 questions items that seemed to describe them. And my husband ran off with them and did a very multifaceted study with probably over 1,000 subjects in different places around the country. And we came up with a 27-item measure of high sensitivity, which we then used for more research. And so it was sort of driven in that way, working with adults. And temperament has been studied a lot in animals and a whole lot in children. It's difficult to study it in adults because, of course, we have all this other history that comes along with us, all of our experiences. So how do you separate temperament from the larger personality with all of its history? But I really believe that if children are born with temperaments, those temperaments are going to show up in adulthood too. So what you can do with adults is you can ask them questions that you can't ask children. And you can also do brain studies, which you cannot do on children because they move around too much in a scan. Yeah. So people, most of the research was on temperament in children. So I was kind of taking off on a new direction. But sure enough, there were about 20% of people who were highly sensitive. And it's not the same as extroversion. We found that there are actually about 30% of highly sensitive people who are actually extroverts and not introverts. It doesn't correlate very well with introversion at all. It looks like it's similar, related to neuroticism, which is partly the fault of the scale, which has too many negative items in it, but I didn't realize that at the time. But it's also because sensitive people are very sensitive to their environments, including in childhood. So if you've had a bad childhood or bad childhood environment, a lot of trouble at school or at home, then you are more prone to depression or anxiety than other people. But if you've had a good supportive life in childhood, supportive at home and at school, then you're less likely to be depressed or anxious than other people. And maybe functioning even better than other people. So this is how the problem with any study of sensitivities, you kind of have to pull out that difficulty. We don't want to associate sensitivity, wrongly scientifically associate sensitivity with neuroticism or depression and anxiety when they don't actually belong together, if you see what I mean.
It's such an interesting point because I would think that high sensitivity happens from not having a good childhood or having to be hyper aware of your environment if you have an alcoholic as a parent or something like that. So it's really interesting to hear that it's a broader range than that. I'd love to hear, what are some of the traits of highly sensitive people?
Well, just to be clear, and I probably wasn't at the beginning, this is considered to be an innate trait, more or less inborn. It's possible that there's things around the time of birth, right after birth, or in the womb might affect it. but for the most part, it is innate. And the hyper vigilance that comes with something traumatic in one's life, including post-traumatic stress syndrome, are things around specific stressors. But this is broad, and it's typically as reactive to positive as to negative. In fact, getting into the traits, one of the things about sensitive people is we're finding now that they appear to be more responsive to positive than to negative stimuli, which is unusual because human beings are oriented to the negative simply because that helps us with our survival. So the way I talk about it now is with I didn't until about 2012, with four, it's an acronym, DOES, or DOES, just helps me to remember and helps other people to remember. The D stands for depth of processing. And I think this is the most important part of the trait, is that humans and animals with this trait prefer to observe and notice subtleties in their environment and process those more deeply before they act. And an experience for them leaves more, you might say, residue in the brain. More experiences are there. And it's not so much that their senses are more keen, it's that they're processing it more deeply. So this depth of processing it's hard to observe it because it's the least observable, and hence it's really not captured in my questionnaire. But it's that tendency, again, to notice and process things more deeply, not through the eyes or ears so much, but in the brain. And we have a number of magnetic resonance imagery studies showing that when on a task of needing to process information, that higher levels of the brain are activated more in sensitive people than in non-sensitive people. By higher levels, that's not a very descriptive term, but parts of the brain that are used in higher levels of perceptual processing. For instance, you see a letter, and then you have to decide whether it's actually a letter or just a shape, and then you have to put it into a word, and then you have to just decide the meaning of the word and then the context of the meaning of the word. So those are what I mean by higher levels or deeper levels of processing. More elaborated is another term for it. The second quality of sensitive people is being easily overstimulated. And if you think of people processing everything more thoroughly, then they're going to wear out sooner. And also, so stimulation might be too loud, or it might be too complex, or new and unfamiliar, or chaotic and complicated. There's many ways in which stimulation can become overstimulated. A person has to deal with a lot of different facets of stimulation, but eventually sensitive people wear out a bit sooner. And this has to do probably with their genetics, that we want to get into genetics. There's a serotonin allele. Serotonin, we know that term from SSRIs, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. Well, serotonin is involved in depression, but in a lot of other very important things. And there's a certain allele, a certain variation, genetic variation that sensitive people appear to have that gives them the variation that would make one more easily depressed under bad circumstances, but not under good circumstances. This variation means that they have less, in a certain sense, of serotonin available in their brains, and therefore we think this might be part of why they get so easily overstimulated. But they're all wound together because the overstimulation comes from the depth of processing, which comes from the serotonin being different. For instance, people with this serotonin mutation are better gamblers because they care so much about whether they win or lose, and therefore they process the information more deeply about the odds of winning or losing.
As you're talking, I'm just thinking about Kamala, and that I think I might need to take her to a casino. But the problem is the lighting, the sounds, and so the thing is they might be better gamblers, but they probably don't gamble.
No, exactly. They hate it. I was known as a child. I loved horses, so my family would take me to the racetrack, and I would go and look at the horses in the paddock and tell them which one was going to win. But it made me so anxious that they were putting money on these bets, and I couldn't stand doing it.
Yeah, the worst place to take me is Las Vegas.
Yes.
So, I want to take this home now for the listener, because as you've been listening, one of the key things that we try to do here at Lasting Love Connection is, at least for me, as someone who comes from a research background, heavily focused in that, I like to see, the research, and you've really just like made this so bona fide, talking about brain scans, adults looking at childhoods, a list of nearly 100 questions, so many different individuals being studied. I'm curious now, though, one of the things that Kamala and I have is she is definitely a highly sensitive person, and she's probably bigger on the spectrum than I am. I think of myself as being highly sensitive. I enjoy a lot of time alone. I enjoy solitude, kind of my own sense of being in my own world. I get overwhelmed at night if there's too many lights or too much stuff happening. But Kamala is kind of like beyond that. She's just a deeper version of that. I'm a little bit more kind of like quote unquote normal. And I say that in the most loving way, babe, that, you're a very sensitive person. How does someone that isn't a highly sensitive person, how does someone become a better partner and treat their highly sensitive partner in a better way? What are some things that we can do?
Well, it sounds like you're pretty sensitive, but we'll just think about it in general. A person, a couple like that. I guess I feel like I need to finish that DOES though,
Yeah,
just a
I'd like
little
to hear
bit.
that. And then,
And it won't take long, and then I'll come back to your question. The E stands for emotional responsiveness, receptivity, responsiveness, intensity, and also empathy. So we have research, brain scans that show that sensitive people respond more to emotional stimuli than neutral stimuli, more to positive than negative. And we have a wonderful study of married couples, newly married couples, that my husband was doing research on, but he put in the HSP scale, and he found that this the empathy was much stronger in sensitive people than non-sensitive people in terms of the areas of the brain that were activated. They were more activated when they saw. So what they were looking at was photographs of their beloved and of a stranger with expressions either of happiness, a joy of some sort, neutral or distressed in some way. So they responded more to their partners than to others. They responded more to the positive pictures of their partners than to their negative in certain areas, because what they actually did when they saw negative pictures or distressed pictures of their partner, the parts of their brain that want to do something were immediately activated rather than the ones around empathy. But the empathy findings were striking because they have to do with the mirror neurons in the brain. And sensitive people have more action in those mirror neurons, which more or less say to us, I'm feeling exactly what you're feeling. So it's not an empathy that has to go through the thinking process. It's just if I see a ball kicked, then there's a part of my brain that kicks the ball also. And then another part of my brain that says, no, don't kick the ball. So if you've ever been watching dancers and suddenly felt your body twitch, it's those mirror neurons wanting to do the same thing that they're doing. So it's empathy by having exactly the same experience almost, but then, knowing it's not you that's having it, but the other person. There's another part of the brain that decides that. So, and then the last one is sensitive to subtle stimuli, which I won't go into the research on that, but that's another one that's true for sensitive people.
That's fantastic. We got depth of processing, easily overstimulated, emotional responsiveness or empathy, and then subtle stimulus.
Sensitivity. Exactly. So then you plug that into a relationship and you have, first of all, the question of what happens.
Chaos. No, I'm just kidding.
Well, I have a good example here because my husband is not as highly sensitive as I am. So I have a lot of experience with that type of relationship. And I like to say that there's a lot of benefits and a lot of problems. It's more complicated and there's more conflict in these relationships until you get it down right. And I think the first thing I tease sensitive people about is when they first find out they're highly sensitive, I say, don't go home and tell your partner and expect that person to be delighted. You hope, oh, I've had this discovery about myself, so certainly my partner will be as delighted as I am. Well, it has implications, doesn't it? First of all, you're saying that you're different from the other person. And, we all like in a way to imagine that we're very much similar or almost merged, but all of a sudden you're saying, whoa, I'm different than you are. Secondly, this means maybe that you have other needs that I didn't know about, and maybe those are going to interfere with my needs. And maybe there's even going to be a shift in power in a sense that one person's been seen kind of as the identified patient or the problem or the not normal person, and all of a sudden they're normal within 20%. They're obviously not on a normal curve. They'd be out at the end. They're not in the middle. They're not where everybody else is, but nevertheless, they're normal. And so their needs are bona fide and their differences are bona fide, and their crying easily is normal and all of that. So the relationship has to go through some adjustment. And I think sensitive people are fascinated by their trait for about 6 months. And then I think they're able to kind of let it calm down and integrate better. But at first, there are things that go on. And I say also that the sensitive person, if they feel their partner is not sensitive, that brings up other issues. So both have to grieve the fact that there are certain things that they're never going to get from their partner. And once that grieving is over, then I think all kinds of creative solutions come along. But I think that has to be faced first. And I think there's a tendency in our culture, including in marriage, to feel that the other person ought to be able to change if they try hard enough. But with temperament, you can't change it. You can try hard, but you can't change it. You can change how you behave around it, but you can't get rid of the difference in temperament.
I love that you brought up this point of how the other person might respond when you bring this to them. And I found your quiz online. I've been following your work for a while. I took your quiz and I scored off the charts. I was it's like every single thing. I was like, that's me. That's me too. Oh, and I told Luis, I took this quiz that I'm a highly sensitive person. And he said, well, I know that. You don't have to tell me. But I think there's a difference here between being really sensitive and in tune with your environment and this kind of sensitivity where you get your feelings hurt easily. And I just wanted to differentiate that, that it's not necessarily that this person, now there's an excuse for them to be hurt all the time. It goes way deeper than that.
You bring up a number of good points. One is that you have to be really careful about using your sensitivity as a club in a relationship. I don't mean a nice club. I mean hitting somebody over the head with it all the time. No, I'm too sensitive. Don't do that to me. Don't say that to me. Whatever, because that wouldn't be fair. Just as it's not, we can get into ways that people use and misuse the trait in conflicts in a minute. But you were saying that, one thing I'd like to make clear is this has a very specific term, and sensitive maybe isn't even the best word for it. I just couldn't come up with a better one. But it doesn't mean the same thing as being sensitive in the sense of being caring. I think, we often say, gee, that was such a sensitive thing to do, meaning that you noticed and you cared and you did something. That isn't really what we mean here. Lots of people who are, quote, not highly sensitive are sensitive in that way. So that's one of the ways that non-sensitive people can react is hearing this, well, you mean I'm not sensitive? I'm trying not to even use that word non-sensitive person. I try to use non-HSP sometimes, or sometimes I'm trying to use now the other 80%, which may be a better way to put it. So it's important that we make that distinction right away.
Definitely. This is so illuminating, really, for me to get into with you. And I'd love to hear a little bit more about how people can work together. I know there's certain things that I've really had to make strong requests that, hey, when you when Luis, when you like repeat these things, or like you're jumping around playing like a child, like it's a little too much for me. Like my system just can't handle it at certain times, and that's just something we've been finally finding a groove with that. And I'd love to hear a little bit more about how that combination of people work together. If someone's highly sensitive, or both people are highly sensitive in a relationship.
Well, one of the best places to start, I think, is what I call volume, which is not only how loud you say things, but how emphatically you say them, how quickly you say them. I'm remembering my husband and I were in some couples counseling once, and I remember the woman who was very sweet but was not highly sensitive. She turned to me and she said, "Elaine, did you do that?" And it was just like it crushed me. What? She said something like, "Well, what were you thinking when you did that?" And it was just the volume was way too hard on me. She could have said, "That's interesting that you said that, Elaine. I wonder what you were thinking," or just more gently than that even. So volume is very important. And I think of things as a scale of 0 to 10. And my husband says, and I think this is true, that I will say something too soft for him to hear, a hint. Gee, it's getting a little warm in here, isn't it? Something like that. And then the next thing he gets from me is a 10. It's, "Why don't you turn the heat down, for heaven's sakes?" Something in between he would have heard. So if you just think of volume in the sort of the emotional push behind it, and get that volume right, because sensitive people may give out high volume, but they can't take high volume. And it's better in relationships not to use high volume at any time. It keeps things calmer and quieter. I know Gottman's work well, and keeps the pulse from going too high just by keeping it calmer in that way. I also wanted to say something about sensitivity to criticism, because the whole wiring of a sensitive person is to process feedback, negative or positive, more deeply. So if you criticize a sensitive person, they're going to process that very deeply, sometimes too deeply. Like they think you meant more than you actually meant. You ask someone, say, this piece of work needs a little editing, and the person goes back and rewrites it, which isn't very helpful because you didn't want it rewritten. So sensitive people can over-respond to criticism, and this is also gets into what their childhoods were like and how much self-confidence they have, and whether they're able to respond to criticism or just go off and feel defeated by it. So sensitivity to criticism in a marriage then, or in a relationship then, has a lot to do with past history between you and past history in the individual too.
The one amazing gift about being highly sensitive is that there's this need to be mindful and monitor yourself and your environment, and how things are affecting you, and how you're affecting your partner, and how your partner is affecting you. And there's a real beauty in that, and being able to be that aware of what you need moment by moment. And an example is the other day, Luis was talking about something that he was really passionate about. He was really excited. And so he was talking loudly and excited about it because we worked together. And what I did is we were outside. And so I went about 15 feet away from him. And then I finally felt comfortable, and I let him just keep talking. He said, "What are you doing over there?" And I said, I'm at a comfortable distance to be able to really hear what you're saying." And so, we can make these adjustments at moment by moment to find what we need moment by moment.
I think that's very good. And making those adjustments without making the other person feel ashamed. And that's always the tricky thing. I talk about the shame ball, and it's so easy in a relationship to feel ashamed and then make the other person feel ashamed instead. You understand what I'm talking about. So to have sensitivity not be a cause of shame for either person. It's not shameful to be speaking loudly. It's not shameful to be bothered by it and need to step back. And by loudly, again, I mean intensity. So it sounds like you're learning to handle that very well. One thing I just want to throw in, because it's important, is that there are just as many men as women who are born highly sensitive. So we don't want to, kind of fasten it to women as it is in my relationship and your relationship. And yet I have friends where the man is highly sensitive and the woman is not. And it's interesting. Men don't recognize their trait as much. And perhaps both because of testosterone and their physiology, but also because of the culture, they tend to bury it a lot more. But it also sounds to me like Louise's style is not as sensitive as yours. Just is, what temperament is in a way is just style, kind of. It's just, and that's why you can't really change it. It's like saying, well, your handwriting should be different. Well, no, you can't really change your handwriting. You make it a little neater, but you're not going to really change it entirely.
That example that Kamala gave about her stepping about 15 feet away while I was talking kind of makes me sound like I just don't notice things. So, you gave some really good, Kamala kind of mentioning some ways that we can take care of ourselves as highly sensitive people. Do you have any other tips for people on how they can do self-care? Because this is a big part of being overly sensitive, is that you're going to get overwhelmed. You might take things more personally and have to do more self-soothing. What are some things that you recommend for people so that they can take care of themselves and handle being highly sensitive in a better way?
Well, I'm going to just step back there for a second and observe your comment of I just don't notice things, because that would be a sad feeling if that felt like something negative. I think that the research on animals and all is that there are advantages to noticing things. There are definite advantages to not noticing things, which I think you're aware of. I mean, it's not that you don't notice everything. It's that you notice a little less, and also that you're able to handle more. So the benefits for the sensitive person with the person who's not highly sensitive, one of the great ones is that you don't notice as much as she notices, which means that you can handle more than she can handle. And there's a lot of times when noticing little things is of no advantage whatsoever. Sometimes it's even an advantage not to notice little things going on in your relationship. So just wanted to comment on that. As far as self-care, if you're noticing everything, yes. One of the things I highly recommend is meditation. Certainly having enough downtime of one type or another. And downtime means not any extra stimulation. So downtime, watching television or listening to TED Talks or something like that is not downtime. That's still stimulation coming in. You need to cut it all off for a little while. And that's when you sort of digest the stimulation that's come in. So you still may be thinking, but you're thinking in a kind of letting your brain go where it wants to go, kind of. Then you can do it on a walk. You can do it sweeping the floor. Sometimes I think some of the best downtime is just doing little chores around the house. So, and also preventing overstimulation, learning to say no and having good boundaries and knowing what you can handle and when you will have had too much. That's something that just increases with experience. But I like the phrase someone gave me in a course. She said, well, I just tell people that that just won't work for me, without any other explanation. I like that very well, because sensitive people tend to feel guilty when they can't do something, and then they try to explain why they can't do it. And then the other person gets helpful and says, well, we'll do it this time, and we'll do it this way, and we'll do it for a shorter time or whatever. And then they're having to basically back down from their position. So it just doesn't work for me. Is a good enough answer because no one can know but you whether you have reached your breaking point where you can't do any more without just falling apart. Nobody knows but you. So it's your responsibility to tell others when you can't do something, and you don't need to explain why. So all the other kinds of self-care that everybody knows about, exercise and diet and all that, are all important. But downtime is probably the unique part of being highly sensitive, needing more of it.
It's So powerful to hear you talk about this, and it's definitely bringing up some deep feelings in me just to have someone have that validated and be able to have the research to back it up. I'd love to hear, just kind of as maybe the last thought, about how your research on sexuality, how sexuality and plays into being highly sensitive and vice versa.
Well, yeah, this was I was writing this book on the highly sensitive person in love, and I thought, well, I'm not going to leave sexuality out of this, but what do I know about it? So being scientists, my husband and I sat down and devised a questionnaire, which I have a website with a lot of people. At that time, I was sending out newsletters. In fact, at that time, everything was being done on paper. And so we sent out a questionnaire, two sets in two envelopes, but one envelope inside the other. We asked people to fill it out anonymously and give the other set to someone who was not highly sensitive to fill it out. But there was also a little measure of the high sensitivity scale in there so that we'd be sure that people were or were not highly sensitive. So we asked a lot of questions, and so we were able to see differences between sensitive people and non-sensitive people in their sexuality. And I think all temperament traits, obviously, we talk about them as style, then everyone's going to have a different style sexually. But it's so important. We all tend to think the other person is like ourselves in every way. And that's why it's easy for two partners, for one person to speak too loudly or something because it's not too loud for them. So why would it be too loud for anybody else? But it is because we're different sometimes. So with sexuality, I found, for instance, that sensitive people found sex more mysterious. They didn't need to do it in lots of different ways because obviously if you're finding it very, very powerful in itself, you don't also need to do it in lavatories of airplanes or any other cool place that somebody else might think would be interesting. They're less interested in things like pornography. But on the other hand, just to say that they did not have more problems sexually than other people, it was interesting that they worried more about how the other person felt, whether they would get pregnant or a sexually transmitted disease, and not having as many partners. But they also said they'd had less traumatic experiences sexually. Well, if you're careful, that's how you prevent those things. So I thought that was interesting too. So, and also they said that they got more, they could be stimulated to the point where it was unpleasant for them, which again, if you're not highly sensitive, you might be doing things for your partner that you think are highly pleasurable that may not be to the partner because it's too much. So the need for communication about these things seems imperative because I said at the beginning that I think there are more conflicts between sensitive and non-sensitive partners, but it's only because of misunderstandings. That does not have to be the case once you communicate. And once you understand, there might be these basic differences between you.
What amazing research. I'm so grateful for you and your husband for doing that. And we're really excited to have Art on the show. This thing about being not sensitive enough, if someone is not a SHP, I think that a tricky thing, if someone's listening, might be that they feel ashamed. Maybe I'm too much, or I'm too loud, or too overbearing, and I'm damaging this highly sensitive person that I'm with. Which I don't think is the case at all.
No, not at all.
And it's the same. It's the other thing is maybe a highly sensitive person might be trying to control their environment, but it's not because they're a controlling person. They just
Right.
might just need, they're very clear on what they need in order to not feel overwhelmed where they are being pushed to the point of falling apart. Are there any last thoughts that you want to make sure that the audience has before we close out?
Well, I like your point about not feeling ashamed of the way that you are, whatever that is, whatever temperament that is, because it seems to me that we're all here, these differences are here for a reason. And I think if we can make good use of each other's differences without feeling bad about them, either in ourselves or in the other person, that's very tricky for the human being. You know, if I say to you hot, cold, north, south, cat, dog, London, Paris, up, down, right, left, you're going to have a favorite. And we humans have a very hard time when we hear about two things, persons of this or that. We always have a preference for this or for that. And that's built into us, but that turns us into a very in-group, out-group species, like other social animals. And then we start to look down on the out-group and to attack them in some way. And I've been saying a lot to sensitive people and everybody else lately is it's time to fight this instinct just as we can fight other instincts like instinct to overeat because, you know, fat and salt seem so tasty when you're a caveman. You know, we can fight this in-group, out-group thing. And we can fight it right in this place of temperament, of not feeling better or worse than somebody else because we're different. So that's the key, I think, that we can all work on as we think about this difference, which is innate. And there's a reason for 20%. There's a reason for the other 80%. In over 100 species, we find this difference within the species of these two kind of personality types. What can we do with this without turning it into a problem?
That's a really great question. And it really loops back around to a lot of the content that we talked about today, especially around the comparison piece, because we tend to want to compare ourselves to other people. And in a relationship, it's really easy to want our partner to be just the way that we are. But the real gift is in our differences. Dr. Harville Hendricks, one of our past guests, he really talks a lot about that, how, you know, our differences and our challenges are actually provide the most rich aspects of growth and connection in a relationship.
I agree very much.
Dr. Elaine, it's been wonderful to have you on the show, to have you here on the Lasting Love Connection podcast. It's been a real honor. Thank you so much for joining us today. And listeners, if you've been listening, please head on over to lastingloveconnection.com. Listen to the interview and all the interviews with our past and previous guests. If you're interested in learning more about Dr. Elaine's work, you can go to hsperson.com. She has a whole website really committed to her practice and her work and her specialty, working with highly sensitive people and couples and sexuality, just kind of covering the whole spectrum for people who are highly sensitive, as well as Dr. Elaine, you have a few books. Do you want to mention your books too, so that if people want to get more in touch with this work, what are some of the books they can look up?
Well, The Highly Sensitive Person in Love is focused on this exactly because Art and I had all this research on love and then this research on sensitivity. So it made a perfect marriage, those two topics. But The Highly Sensitive Person is the original book, and there's a workbook that goes with it. And then there is the book, The Highly Sensitive Child, which has been very important to many people. You go on the internet, there's so many people talking about their sensitive child with each other and how to raise them. And that's a really important topic because we want to avoid problems in adulthood. We've got to raise these children right in order to get the best from them instead of turning them into, you know, children who need a lot of therapy when they grow up because their parents just didn't understand them. So those are the books, and I really appreciate your having me on the show very much.
It's been such a pleasure to have you here. Again, we'll have all those resources as well at lastingloveconnection.com if you've missed any of that. Thank you so much, Doctor.
You're welcome. Bye-bye.